It started on a Tuesday, just after dawn, when a shiny black SUV eased into the cul-de-sac and settled deliberately across my driveway, like it owned the space between my mailbox and my front step. I walked out in my slippers, coffee going cold in my hand, and watched the driver read the paper like he'd parked on private property, because private property was exactly what he thought it wasn't. That's how small wars begin: an ordinary morning and a tiny, deliberate insult, and you either let them be or you answer. My name's Evan Mercer. I grew up on a patch of land where fences mean something and where the line on a deed was as sacred as the family name on a headstone. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy to make a scene, but I'm stubborn, and stubborn is a quality that, when pushed, becomes trouble. I'd paid my mortgage, kept my yard up, waved at neighbors. I'd filed polite complaints for months about board overreach and petty fines, about meetings held without notice, about rules enforced unevenly. Each complaint came back with the same neutral little envelope and the same polite dismissal. Then the SUV showed up. She was the kind of person who never got her hands dirty and whose smile had been calibrated for polite cruelty. Clara Beaumont, HOA president, porcelain teeth, and the kind of resume that should have been on a non-profit board in the city, not in our little ridge of patched roofs and kids' bicycles. Clara liked rules when they suited her. She liked control, and mostly, she liked people who moved when she said move. The SUV bore a bumper sticker about community standards. The sticker was almost a joke. She drove like the world owed her space. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I stood on my porch, watched the tail lights through the steam of my breath, and I felt something settle in my chest that was equal parts anger and a weird, heavy amusement. You get to a certain AGA 38, with a dog, a rusted rowboat in the yard, and a collection of half-finished projects in the garage when petty insults become detonators. I told myself I'd do this right. No theatrics that would end with me in court for trespass, no front yard pyrotechnics that would break the law I'd always respected. I'd build a case. I'd make it visible. I'd use the one thing Clara and her cronies couldn't completely hide: other people. The first week was paperwork and patience. I photographed the SUV every morning, a dozen times, from every angle: license plate, bumper sticker, the way it leaked oil a little when old men go for their second cup. I logged every interaction with the HOA, names, times, exact phrases. I printed bylaws that contradicted their behavior and highlighted passages like a man prepping for a sermon. I went to the county recorder and pulled every public record I could, and what looked like small sloppiness grew into a worrying pattern: missing minutes, unfiled amendments, money moving in ways that didn't add up. It wasn't explosive evidence yet. It was a breadcrumb trail. But breadcrumbs lead somewhere if you follow them long enough. What changed the tone, though, was the spectacle. I'm not proud of wanting it, maybe that's human, but I knew how the internet and small towns worked. People care about things when there's something to see. So I put something obvious in my driveway: a pair of bright, commercial-grade planters anchored in the concrete, painted a ridiculous color like a neon dare. They took up space and made a statement without harming a person or a car. When the SUV arrived again and rolled slowly over one of them, Clara didn't look surprised. She looked offended. The planter exploded into a smear of bright paint and soil, the whole scene ridiculous and humiliating in a way that made neighbors look up from their porches. Someone filmed it from across the street and posted it. The clip went slow: the SUV, the planter, the smear opening like a period at the end of a sentence the HOA had been writing for years. The neighborhood woke up. Folks started texting me, tentatively at first, then with the boldness of people who had been quietly simmering for months. We saw it, they wrote. Finally, the board called an emergency meeting. There was a flurry of emails insisting the planters were hazardous, a danger to the community. Clara wrote me a polite, clipped letter demanding I remove them immediately or face fines. I replied with copies of the bylaws, with the county land records, with a simple line: if the board intends to enforce the bylaws, please do. That line was a kind of challenge and an invitation. Here's the thing about playing it straight: if you keep the moral high ground, people rally around you fast. They don't like bullies. We held a community meeting in my garage. Not everyone came, but enough did. Neighbors with sun-scarred hands, a woman who ran the diner on the corner, a retired math teacher who could read a ledger like scripture. We traded stories: unauthorized fines, inspections scheduled at dawn, Mail about landscaping choices delivered with the tone of moral condemnation. Each story was a nail. Each nail built a frame for something bigger. They began, reluctantly at first, to tell me what they'd seen: odd invoices, payments to a P.O. box, a private contractor hired for maintenance, who lived in a neighboring county and seemed to show up only when certain cars came through. We didn't set out to be outlaws. We became investigators because someone had to be. But investigation, in a small town, can be theatrical. We canvassed. We asked people to pull their doorbell camera footage from certain nights, only footage where something suspicious might have happened, only footage they were willing to share. A collection of video clips slid into my inbox like confessionals. I watched a blurry figure in a hoodie at 3 a.m., saw a truck at the edge of someone's property where it shouldn't have been. Nothing conclusive, but the pattern hardened. Someone was moving around at night, turning locks, leaving unsigned notices pinned to doors. Clara escalated. It's funny how the people who claim to want community always prefer the version where they have the veto. She chaired a special board meeting, invited only a select few, and issued a new set of fines. The fines were surgical, small amounts earmarked to be unbearable if you were a family on a tight budget. Then the threats moved from paper to people. My mail was rifled. My mailbox cracked open like someone wanted to see what I was hiding. A neighbor reported that her ornamental bird bath had been smashed and her mailbox set on fire. Small, symbolic acts intended to be loud. The sheriff, Pete Langford, who's been with us long enough to trade yard gossip and bad coffee, came by once, then twice. He listened, fetched, and filed reports. He didn't smile much because he'd seen these things before. People poking at other people until someone poked back, and then everyone regretted the poke. At some point, the strategy shifted from passive documentation to public pressure. We organized a petition, not a revolutionary one, just a long list of signatures asking for transparent financial records, for minutes from board meetings to be posted publicly, for a recall vote. We organized a community forum at the town hall, filled the seats, and spoke in measured tones. No threats, no theatrics. We spoke about the basics: transparency, accountability, fairness. We had a stack of receipts, odd checks made out to community expenses with little explanation, invoices from the same vendor for different work on the same day. Tick, tick, tick. Those little anomalies make people nervous if you put them under a proper light. That night, something happened that changed the tenor of everything. My Ring camera, a cheap little thing, recorded a truck pulling into the street at 2:13 a.m. Two men got out, hunched low. They walked like people who'd done this sort of thing before. One of them carried a long shape wrapped in dark cloth. I watched the footage 3 times, then watched it again because denial is a useful, soft pillow. They moved to the community dock where a cluster of us kept old boats, turned over a lantern, and tried clumsily, maddening lightos, start a fire. It's one thing to smash a bird bath or to break a mailbox. It's another to try and burn something down. The truck got away, but the truck left a license plate that matched a subcontractor who, curiously, had been paid by the HOA for maintenance. We turned the footage over to Pete. He didn't make promises of a swift arrest. He made a promise that he'd investigate. That, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. When you have someone trying to intimidate you with arson, you either rebuild or you fight, and the fight doesn't have to be violent to be decisive. We started a neighborhood watch, purely legal, purely visible. We installed more cameras: doorbell cams, porch cams, a couple of inexpensive motion cameras. We lit more porches. Not all of it was high drama, mostly it was patience, noise, presence. You can't start a fire when people are watching. The cameras caught small things: a figure trying to loosen a gate latch at 1 a.m., a light flipping on at a house where no one was supposed to be, a car sitting too long outside someone's driveway. We cataloged everything. Pete's team came more often, took notes, and at one point took a shoebox of our collected invoices and receipts to the county investigator. Clara went to the press release stage. She called us troublemakers, suggested that we were trying to wreck the harmony of the neighborhood. Her allies wrote op-eds about maintaining standards and the dangers of vigilantism. Her tone was performative, smooth, like silk over steel. But there was a hairline crack in her armor. When the county started asking for bank statements and vendor contracts, her voice sounded less certain. People are good at projecting authority until someone asks a question they can't answer. The P.O. box she'd used for community mail was linked to a shell LLC whose owners very conveniently people who benefited from the contractor's invoices. The math smelled like someone had been taking liberties under the cover of civic duty. Then came the night we baited the trap. We didn't set a trap to hurt anyone. We set a trap to record truth. We left a small, obvious marker at my driveway. Not dangerous, just visible. And then we watched. The marker was there the next morning. Then it wasn't. And a neighbor's camera on the corner, one of the ones we'd installed, had a clear shot of a person in a hoodie taking it. The footage was blurry but showable. It brought more people to the table. One of the men in the truck was an associate of Clara's, someone who had been seen at HOA gatherings and whose truck matched invoices. When we presented the footage to Pete, and when we presented the pattern of payments to the county, the wheels that had been turning slowly began to move faster. I won't pretend it was clean. There were threats over the phone that were vague enough to be legally deniable and specific enough to be terrifying. There was a night when some one anonymous voice left a bundle of flyers at my door. "Keep your nose out, Mercer." My wife, Jenna's been my soft landing, and my dog, Cooper, felt the tension in the house. Jenna told me quietly that she didn't want me to become obsessed, to let this swirl us into a bad place. She was right, and I'd been wrong. The fights we picked become part of us, and I could feel anger folding into the edges of me like a second skin. I had to remind myself to come back to the basics: evidence, law, community. The county subpoenaed the HOA's records. That's the kind of two-syllable word that makes people start whispering and makes official voices fill with cautious optimism. The investigator found things that didn't add up. Contractors paid for new landscaping. That never occurred. A line item labeled security supplies corresponded with purchases that included private equipment for one of Clara's friends. There were payments to a company that, when traced, had the same mailbox as the LLC. It was a web that had been woven intentionally and carelessly all at once. Sometimes corruption is sloppy people get greedy and forget the rules that would hide them. Sometimes it's meticulous people hide behind bylaws and the language of community while lining their pockets. Ours looked like a messy hybrid of both. When evidence has a smell, the county's investigators are the kind of people who can tell. They asked for interviews. They asked for bank statements. The sheriff Pete brought a calm legitimacy to our kitchen table. He'd listen and nod, and then file the thing he'd heard. I remember sitting at the table once, with a stack of receipts in one hand and a bowl of cold coffee in front of me, watching him flip through the pages. He looked up and said, "You did right. You came through the right door." That line mattered less for what it was than for who said it. Someone who'd spent years making sure the law mattered in a place where favors often mattered more. There was a hearing, a public one, at the county courthouse where Clara sat with a composed face, and our small group sat in the audience like a human ledger. People we'd never met stood up and spoke. A woman from 2 streets over described fines that had landed on her after she'd placed a small vegetable garden in her front yard. A man who'd lived here for 40 years talked about the meeting where he'd been shouted at for asking questions. A kid who worked at the diner said he'd been fined for improper signage after posting a flyer for the community bake sale. These things mattered because they were concrete. The community could point to petty injustices and say, "This, right here, is why we asked for oversight." Then the arrests came. It was not cinematic in the way movies imagine arrests. No dramatic lights, no slow-motion doubling of guilt. It was a quiet morning with subdued cars pulling up near the HOA office, a few officers stepping out, paper in hand. People said later that Clara looked surprised. I think she looked shocked in that shallow way of people who believed they were untouchable and then found out they were not. The charges were a tangle: fraud, conspiracy to defraud, misappropriate funds. The legal process unfolded as it always does, slowly, resistantly, with tangles of appeals and the hygienic language of motions that could make the blood of a layman run cold with boredom. But the core truth was simple. We documented a pattern, and we followed the rules. The law, in this case, caught up with a series of small betrayals that, strung together, became a big one. After the arrests, the neighborhood felt like a body after a fever break, shocked, raw, relieved, and a little unsteady. People asked what would happen next. We elected a new board, people who lived here and who had no creative accounting to answer for. The new board posted minutes, posted receipts, and set a meeting schedule that was public and routine. We created a small fund for community projects that was audited by 2 independent neighbors. We put real teeth into bylaws that had been rubbery and vague. There was a ritual to the restorations, a shared barbecue, a day to repair the smashed birdbath and repaint a mailbox, people offering to fix things instead of letting anger do the work. Healing is not a linear thing. It's a series of small, practical actions. I changed too. I learned the geometry of my temper, where it sits, and how far it can be pushed before I cross into something I can't easily take back. I learned the difference between righteous anger and the dangerous kind that eats people from the inside. My hands, which used to fix fences and mend boats, learned to cradle evidence and to file minutes. I kept a few cameras out, not because I wanted to become a sentinel for life, but because we'd learned that visibility was safety in a place where secrets had been weaponized. There are people who'll tell you we overreacted, that this was a simple misunderstanding turned ugly. They have a point. Power struggles never lack for nuance, but there's a difference between disagreement on policy and a pattern of behavior designed to silence dissent while enriching a few. That's where we drew a line. We didn't try to ruin lives. We tried to restore fairness. We didn't pick at a scab to watch blood. We peeled back a bandage to see an infection and then treated it. The climax, if you want to call it that, was not a single cinematic scene but a slow compression of small truths that, when collected, looked like damning evidence. The arson attempt, the night patrols, the invoices with duplicate entries, each was a pebble in a creek that eventually eroded a bank. What satisfied people was not the arrest. There's a curious absence of joy in justice meted out by the law, but the restoration. The new board reinstated community scholarship funds, fixed the dock lights, and started a picnic bench program named the Common Table. We built a bench from reclaimed wood with the names of neighbors hand-carved into the slats. It wasn't a monument to victory. It was a practical thing you could sit on in the afternoon. But I would be lying if I said there weren't costs. Trust is brittle. A few neighbors moved away in the months after, the ones who couldn't stomach the publicness of the fight. Others stayed, carrying the invisible scars of having been lied to. Clara and her associates faced consequences, and some of them tried to come back with apologies that sounded like rehearsed lines. Forgiveness is a transaction. Sometimes it's earned, sometimes it's not. We kept our vigilance, which is the boring, ongoing cost of a community trying not to go back to old ways. A few months after everything quieted, a reporter asked me what I'd learned. I said something simple. That community is a verb. It's not a slogan you put on a bumper sticker. It's the work you do when someone else's pet project becomes your problem. It's the meetings you attend, the minutes you read, the small kindnesses you offer when no one's watching. It's the decision to be present. The reporter wanted a quote that sounded like a headline. I gave him a line that sounded like dinner conversation. If your community is worth living in, it's worth defending, but defend it with facts, with law, with people at your side. The real twist, and the part that made people argue late into the night on porch stoops, was the ending, not a tidy one, because tidy endings are for movies. Clara served her sentence, faced fines, and later tried to start a consultancy on community standards in a different town. Irony follows some people like a shadow. Some neighbors wanted more punitive measures. Some wanted restorative circles where people could air grievances and truly try to repair harm. We settled on a middle path. Accountability was necessary, but so was the possibility of a different future where people learned and stayed. I drive past the bench we built and sometimes stop to sit, not to celebrate, but to think about the strange, human machinery of small towns. People say that communities reveal themselves under pressure. Ours revealed both its rot and its capacity to heal. That's the paradox. Pressure separates the weak from the resolute, and sometimes both are necessary to see what's true. If you've ever lived in a place where committees rule and petty power corrodes trust, you know the feeling. The slow drip of something that should be shared turned into something controlled by a few. If you're on the sidelines thinking you'd never step in, good. I hope you never have to. But if you do watch something happen that feels wrong, consider this: documenting it, bringing people together, and using the structures that exist. Transparency, petitions, public meetings are powerful. Rage without structure is just noise. Structure without will is cowardice. Combine the two carefully. We ended with a public forum one warm evening, long after the sheriff and the county had done their work. A new committee sat on the dais, hands visible, receiving questions from the crowd. A kid from the diner asked whether people like Clara could come back and be part of the community again. The question was blunt and honest. The new chair looked at the faces in the crowd and said, "People can change, and they must show it. We can't erase what happened, but we can decide how we move forward together or apart." The crowd murmured. It wasn't a tidy answer, but it was true. So if you're listening to this from some city you love or from a pocket of rural dirt where your granddad once taught you about deeds, think of your community like a garden. Gardens need boundaries, sure, but they also need tending. They need people who will pull the weeds and plant the flowers. They need folks who will sit on benches and watch the seasons pass. They also, sometimes, need a little noisy a planter tipped over, a smear of bright paint, a visible signal that says, "We are paying attention." But make the signal honest, legal, and useful. Make it about drawing light to things that need fixing, not about humiliation. I'm not a crusader. I'm a guy who likes his coffee hot and his mail intact. I want fishing mornings without drama, and yet I learned that sometimes you have to choose a fight to save what you love. If this story leaves you wondering about the right thing to do when you see power misused, good. Be present. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done differently? Was I too public, too dramatic, too careful, or not careful enough? When does fighting back become part of the problem? And when is it the only sane option? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what justice looks like to you in a small community. And if you've ever had to stand up, how you did it. Share this with someone who lives in a neighborhood with a board that loves power a little too much. If you like the story, share it. And if you want more tales from places where fences and family names matter, subscribe and stick around. There are more mornings and more driveways ahead.